In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Christ is in our midst.
He is in our midst.
A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. These are the words of Jesus Christ, the God-man. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. These are the words of the Apostle John the Theologian, whose memory we keep this day, and he was the beloved disciple of Christ. And, O beloved ones, just as his words mimic Christ's words, so his life mimicked the life of Christ, because he was like unto him. I had this great and immeasurable joy and blessing to read the whole life of John the Theologian in preparation for today, and it was such a great blessing. Today's gospel marks this defining moment in which John is at the foot of the cross, the only disciple to be there. There was no other disciple near the cross. They're all gone. John is present, and so is the Theotokos. And John, his love is so great for Christ and for his mother that he doesn't ever leave them. And this is why Christ bestows this blessing upon him, that he should take the Theotokos as his mother. And John truly is a different kind of disciple, a different, set apart, honestly. He's the youngest of all the apostles. And when the time came for them to give lots, to say, you will go to this part of the earth, you will go to this part of the earth, they gave his lot last, because he was the youngest of them all. And yet, he was different, because he alone had this boldness to lay his head on Christ's breast. You know, Peter was supreme. Peter was the highest apostle. But he didn't have this blessing. He didn't have this honor. And the reason was because of John's love, his deep purity, the deepness of his soul. John, though, wasn't perfect. When he received his token, his statement, sending him to go to Asia Minor, he actually had a doubt in this moment. And he burst into tears, and all the apostles looked at him and they said, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, I had a doubt. I didn't think that I could do this. And so I hesitated to say yes to it. I hesitated to say yes to my lot that was given to me. And he was very, very sorrowful because his heart was so pure. But because he was so exalted, God actually punished him for this moment of doubt. He actually did this because John was so exalted. And so when John took Prochorus, the deacon, he went to Ephesus, and he only did this after the Mother of God had reposed. John never went on his missionary journeys really until the Mother of God departed. He might have gone on some journeys. I know the Mother of God visited Athos, but he wasn't doing his real missionary work until she had reposed, because he was so serious about taking care of her. So when she died, he put her in her tomb, and then he went on his journey. As he was on the boat, sailing for Ephesus, sailing for Asia Minor, John was crying, because he said, something very bad will happen. It was because of my sins. And it was true. Something bad happened. The ship was wrecked. Everyone survived, every single person except John. He was washed out to sea for 40 days. So just as the prophet Jonah was chastised by God because he ran away from God in his work, the Lord, but he was only chastised for 3 days. That was the prophet Jonah. God chastened John for 40 days. He put him in the depths of the sea for 40 days, and he was clinging to wreckage. And of course, this was all miraculous because no one can live 40 days in the ocean. There's no possibility. And so he survived because of God's blessing. But God said to him, you need to trust in me. You need to rely upon me, because you are the theologian. If you're going to be the theologian, you have to have a higher standard. And so he held him to this. But this really changed John, and when he came out of this, he was much more loving and even much more humble and much more graceful than he had been before, because his insufficiency was made up for. And so he went to Ephesus, and he went there, and he was there for not a very long time, maybe a couple of years, when he was arrested and taken to Rome, tortured, and no tortures could harm him. And so the Emperor Domitian said, you must be immortal. I'm going to exile you to Patmos. And that was his response to this. And so he sent him to Patmos, this little island, about 34 square kilometers, very small island in the Aegean, near Turkey. Patmos is like a microcosm of this world. You know, Paul travels all over the world. He travels all throughout Asia Minor. He travels to Macedonia. He travels to Athens. He goes to Rome. He goes to Spain. He goes all over the place. Paul never stops traveling. But John doesn't seem to travel that much. He stays in Jerusalem with the Mother of God. He goes to Ephesus. Then he's taken to Rome. Then he goes to Patmos. And he stays in Patmos for 15 years. He spends 15 years on this little island that is about 34 square kilometers. Very small island. And Patmos is like a microcosm of the world because it's full of idolatry. It's actually full of human sacrifice. It's crazy. Patmos is this really weird, dark place. But that's how the whole world is, and was, and still will be. There's demon possession. There's massive sickness. People are ill. There's extreme lust. There's a mother he meets on the island who's trying to seduce her own son, like Lord of Mercy. It's very bizarre. This island is a crazy place. There's powerful magicians that live on this island, and there's violence, and John experiences all of it. But John reacts to it the very same way Christ reacted when he went into Judea. John comes with this intense patience. And as Christ said in the beginning, this quote that I gave to you from the Gospel, and also what John says, God is known through love. Right? When John goes to Patmos, there's all kinds of signs, there's all kinds of magicians. There's a magician on Patmos who has the power to seemingly resurrect the dead. He will summon demons and he will have them take on the form of relatives that have died. He will say, I resurrected your relatives. I've done this. And the people believe this. I mean, they worship this man as a god. They do whatever he says. And he has all these signs. And he says to John, can you raise the dead? Which John actually can, easily. But John says, Christ did not send me to raise the dead. He sent me to preach the gospel. And so what John reveals is that God is revealed through love. And this is how John labors in this island. He works many, many miracles. He raises many people from the dead. And in fact, this magician assaults him so badly and convinces the people to attack John that they beat him to within an inch of his life. And they leave him on the beach. And this magician says, I'm going to go and resurrect more people. I'll go into the ocean and do this. And so he goes off in this miraculous way into the ocean, it seems. And John, this is the only person that John is really harsh with. John collects himself, he stands up and he makes the sign of the cross over the ocean. He says, may this man never see the sun again. And he doesn't, ever again. But these people who've beaten him, John still loves them. And in fact, this magician is so intense that the people wait on the beach for him to come back from the ocean for 3 days, neither eating nor drinking. And 3 children die from this fasting that they've imposed upon themselves to bring back the magician. And John says, oh my goodness, people. And he raised the 3 children from the dead, and he loves them. And he goes throughout the island, and he loves these people, like the woman who's trying to seduce her son. This is a horrible story. But he saves her, and he saves the son. They're saved because John is so merciful, and John is so patient. John meets some Jews on the island, and being a Jew, he loves them, and he wants them to be saved. And he meets this Jew named Keros, who really is a kind of cantankerous guy. He doesn't agree with John at all, and they argue intensely about the book of Moses and everything. They argue a lot. And actually, the man begins to blaspheme. He gets so upset he begins to blaspheme. He yells at John. He says, you should be silent, you crazy man. And John silences him so that he won't blaspheme anymore. And there's a philosopher who watches the whole exchange. And the philosopher can see all the goodness of Christianity. And he motions towards Keros. He says, go and prostrate before John. Go prostrate before him. I mean, he's mute. He can't talk. He says, go prostrate. And then the philosopher turns to John and he says, he said, honey is sweet, and nothing bitter comes from it. You are a loving man and you serve the God of love. For the sake of love, the Holy One, release this man. And John says, of course I will. And he releases this man from his muteness. And he says, in the name of Christ you were muted, in the name of Christ you were unmuted. And he swears to speak again. And he says, Rabbi, to John, forgive me. I am like the people of old who argued against God, forgive me. And he is baptized. There's another Jewish man on the island named Philo who also is very learned, and he also argues with John, but John loves him so much. Being a Jew, he loves him so much. And they argue for 3 days. And finally, on the 3rd day, they've exhausted all arguments. John has not convinced him, but he's also bested him. He's getting ready to leave because this argument is no longer profitable. The people of the island, who by now know that John can heal anything, bring this person, just like they did to Christ. They bring this man, this young man with a fever, and they lay him at his feet and say, oh, Holy One of God, please raise this man up. Heal him, please. And St. John just makes the sign of the cross over him, and he is well. And Philo, the Jew, who it turns out has a wife at home with leprosy, he is amazed by this, and he's overtaken by this act of love. And he says to John, he goes and he grabs his hand, and he says, Father, what is love? And John says, to observe the law and to serve your neighbor, and if you do this, you will know God. And the man says, come and teach me about God. Come to my house. And John says, of course I will come. And as soon as he enters the man's house, his wife is healed. Just not even by prayer, not even by the cross, nothing. Just his entrance heals the woman. And Philo says, I'm sorry that I ever argued with you. Forgive me. And John says, of course, son, go forgive me. And he baptizes him, and his wife, and his whole family. He deals with pagan priests. He deals with all these people. Many pagan priests completely convert. They completely repent, especially if he heals them. And so God is revealed through this love. And the island is so dark because in this island there isn't love. There's plenty of love of money. There's love of idols. There's love of strange passions and unnatural passions. There's all kinds of bizarre stuff on this island, which really represents the whole world, actually. Everyone is in darkness and in sadness. And there's actually wealth on the island, too. There is money there. There is trade going on. But there's no joy. There's no deep light. There's no love. Because there's no love, there's nothing. These poor people suffer, but as they come to see John and the way that he acts, they change. And they're completely changed by him. And beloved, they've changed so much. Like there's another story that's really striking about what it was like in the early church and how people were. Basically, he converts, one of the first people he converts is this man named Miron, who's like the leader of the island. Or he's not the leader, but he's this rich man whose son-in-law is the governor. And so he converts Miron. Miron really converts. He converts Miron's whole family. And then his daughter, who's married to the governor, comes to the governor and she says, I want to be with my father. I want myself and our son and you to all convert to Christianity. And the governor actually doesn't have any problems with Christianity. He says, that's fine, but I'm a governor and I can't really be a Christian and be a governor at the same time. There's a huge conflict in this. There'll be problems with this. But you should go and convert and you should take our son and have him baptized too. And I'll come when I can. After my governorship is over, in 2 years, I'll become a Christian too. And the woman says, okay. So she goes to her father's house where John is living. John lives with her father. And when she shows up, she basically, she comes to John and she says, I want to be a Christian. And John says, does your husband know about this? And she says, yes. And he says, okay. But then her father says, you should stay here and never go home again. And everyone says, well, why? And her father says, because I do not want you to fail in even one commandment of Christ. If your husband's not a Christian, perhaps you'll make one mistake following Christ. I don't want you to make any. Just stay here with us. And his daughter says, yes, I will do this. I will go and I will get some money and food and I'll come back and I won't go home again. So this is how zealous they were. They didn't want to violate even one commandment. They didn't want to stray from the illumination John had given to them, even by the slightest degree. And John said, no, I'm sorry. He said, Christ didn't send me to separate husbands and wives. Your husband will convert. Go home to me. He will convert. And so she goes home. And eventually her husband converts and everything is well with them. But it saddens me so much to see in our world today that love is so cold. When the fathers say, when will the ends come? When will evil come? And men say, when there is no longer a road between neighbors. As in, when the path of love grows cold. And the path of love in Patmos was cold, but John revived it. He revived it and made it wide. He made it powerful. And so we should love, beloved. We should seek love. And I look at our own city, our own society, and I look at the church, and I see what we lack is great love. The pastors do not possess the love they should have. Many of them possess learning, but they don't possess love. What profit the man if he gained the whole world? He can gain anything he wants, knowledge, power, money, everything. But he will lose his own soul. What will he give in exchange for his soul? What would save his soul? Love would save his soul. If he had love, he would be happy. Even if he was in poverty, he would be happy. Even if he was suffering, he would be joyful if he had love. His love covers over everything. We undertake labors in piety to please our egos, but without growth in love, we have missed everything. And St. John shows us this. He is apart. The holy forerunner and Baptist is the greatest man born of women. And one time in this monastery, I've told this before when I was preaching about John the forerunner, but there was a monastery where they would argue about who is greater, John the Theologian or John the Baptist. And they argued and they argued and they argued at this big feast they were having until this giant silver chalice split in half. And it was odd, strange. This happened in the middle of their feast. And finally, this monk who was smarter said, go weigh them both. Weigh each one of them. And they weighed each piece and they were identical. And so even though the Baptist is the greatest man born of women, John, theologian, is equal to him in love. He's equal to him. When they went to bury John, after 15 years, he wrote the Gospel, he wrote the Apocalypse, and he went back to Ephesus and he was there for 26 years and taught the people and loved them and guided them with great love. And there's a great story about this young man that John found, and he loved this young man and he raised him up and he made him a Christian and he gave him to a bishop and he said, take care of my son. Make sure that my son learns everything he needs to know because I must journey and continue my missionary work. And the bishop said yes. So John went away for some years, laboring and toiling and preaching the gospel. When he came back, he says, where's my son? The bishop said, your son is dead in soul, but in his body he has become a robber. He is lost. He has become dead to Christ. He has left the Christian life and has become a thief, a murderer. And John said, you negligent man, I gave you my son and you have killed him. And John, who's very old, like at this point, aged, like really aged, gets on a horse and chases after this young man until he finds wherever he is. And he goes and he finds the bandits, and he finds the bandit leader. He says, this is my son, I want him back. And he basically said, son, come back to Christ with me. Come back with me. And even in his agedness, the apostle went and did this. It's like a different version of the prodigal son story. Like the prodigal son goes away, but this time the father chases him and captures him and brings him back, which is exactly what John did. All the apostles, their relics are everywhere. Their relics are where Peter and Paul were in Rome, and all the apostles were scattered throughout all the world. Many of them died very, very, very violent deaths. But John the Theologian didn't die this way at all. In fact, John was so peaceful that when he was dying, he said to his apostles, he said to his disciples who were with him, the bishops, priests, those who followed closely with him, he said, let's go to this place I know. And so they went with him to this place. And he said, dig a grave crosswise, like as a cross, like a baptismal font was in the old days, as long as I am tall. And then he laid in it. Maybe he actually spread his arms cruciform and he laid in his grave, because the grave was dug in the cross form. And he said, kiss me, embrace me. And they embraced him, kissed him. He said, now bury me up to my waist. And he said, now kiss me again. And they kissed him and embraced him. And he said, bury me up to my neck. And then he says, now lay a veil over my face. And he kissed me one more time. And they did this. And he said, now depart. And he died this way. And then, of course, the entire people were really upset, because when they found out that the apostle had died, everyone said, why did you take him away and bury him without us? We're very upset. We want to go see where he's buried. And so all the people went off to the place, and they found nothing there. His grave was absolutely empty. Totally empty. So he, like the Theotokos, was taken up to heaven, bodily. After he died, after his soul went up, so did his body, because his love was so great, and this impressed God so much. Beloved, forgive me, I'll give one aside. I know another example of this, like John's, one example like this. During the Byzantine times, there was an emperor whose family was massacred. They were murdered. There was usurpers. They rose up against the emperor, and they murdered him, and they decided we need to kill every one of his children so there would be no heirs. But they killed all of his sons, every single one of them. Even if they were 2, 1, didn't matter. They killed them all. But the nurse of that family, the imperial nurse who guarded the children, she loved this family so much that she exchanged her child for one of the emperor's children. So she gave her own son to be executed so that one of the emperor's sons would live and perhaps become king. And she raised him for a while. But then she told the emperor's son this story. And he lost his mind. He said, oh my goodness, really? Like you gave your son in exchange for me? And he said, my life is no longer mine. He said, I'll go to Mount Athos to become a monk, and so I'll offer this life as a monk in exchange for your son who was murdered for me. And so he went off and he became a monk. And he labored really hard. And he was obscured. No one knew that he was of noble birth. No one knew until this was somehow miraculously revealed. But he labored and labored and labored. All the monks revered him. And then he died. And on Mount Athos, they don't have a lot of space to bury people, so what they do is they dig them up after a few years so they can put their bones in an ossuary and use that grave for someone else. And so they went to open his grave and there was nothing there. Nothing was there. He had resurrected also. God was so impressed with his love that he took him straight to heaven, both body and soul. It wasn't enough for his soul, his body too, God wanted. Because he was so full of love. This man was so filled with love. And this is how John was. Peter wasn't resurrected yet. Peter's bones are still with us. So are Paul's. So are the forerunners. But John's, his body's in heaven. When John got really, really old, John would say these words to his people. He got so old he couldn't preach much anymore. And so he would give these words, but he'd say them over and over again. He would say, little children, love one another. Little children, love one another. Little children, love one another. And finally, one of his disciples said to him, why do you say this, elder? You say this always, Father. Why do you say it always? He says, beloved, he says, this is the Lord's commandment, and if you keep it, it is enough. It is enough. Beloved, let us love one another, and so for us it will also be enough. Amen.